Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today, the next 100 years workforce of tomorrow. I am joined by four amazing individuals today, thought leaders on this subject. My colleagues here at Cornell, Vince Lau and Tasha Lakani, and my industry partners, Catherine Gross and JD Barnes. Thank you all for joining us today. Really do appreciate your willingness to share your insights on this topic. It's a very interesting one, and it's fraught with a lot of really kind of sticky wicket issues, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of those today. We're going to share insights about where we are, competitively speaking, today, and some of the key trends and workplace challenges that are especially salient in the hospitality industry. And then building on that landscape view of what's going on now, we're going to discuss some future scenarios that will likely evolve from a variety of different forces, ranging from technology to wellness considerations and things in between. So to get started, Catherine, I'd like for you to shed some light on what you're seeing in terms of key priorities from a workforce standpoint and some of the things that you're seeing our industry partners keeping them up at night.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. When we are, as a software company, when we are talking to our customers, I think from a hotel perspective, they are very much looking at information and data and how to use this information to make smarter decisions, whether that be around processes, whether that be around how their staff is doing, but trying to have the information at hand to improve and to do things better and to use information to change and to evolve. When we're thinking about the staff in the hotels and the users of our software, it's very much, the labor market has shifted. And so we're thinking about ease of use. How simple is it? How intuitive is it? How straightforward, and where it isn't intuitive and straightforward, how can they find that information to be quick and don't need to step into long training sessions or software education sessions?
Nice. JD, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I would echo Catherine's sentiments. I think everything that she mentioned there are considerations that we at Hilton are looking at. I think a lot of our focus and attention is on employee well-being, right? The last few years have been very difficult times for a number of folks, certainly for our team members on the front line. And mental wellness is front and center to everything we're focused on. How do we provide resources for our team members around those components? I think certainly the labor market, as Catherine has mentioned, has shifted. And I think there are a lot of behaviors that people have experienced in their personal lives and how they engage with technology from a consumer perspective that we need to start morphing into the employee experience. How can we replicate what they see and what they use with the technology that they have at home into the work experience and give them connection points that mirror those experiences? So those are probably the two primary focuses for us.
So a question for JD and for Catherine. When you say the labor force or the labor market has shifted, can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that? What do you mean when you say it has shifted? Are you talking about who's in the labor force or what they want out of work?
Yeah, I'd say it's both factors. I think certainly, we lost a lot of folks that had a lot of tenure within the hospitality space, through the pandemic. I think, hospitality generally, I think, was disproportionately impacted by COVID and the pandemic, with a lot of folks, leaving our industry to pursue other professions, to look for other opportunities. And so we're really faced with two challenges. One is, how do we bring folks back to the industry that may have left? How do we modernize some of the opinions of what it means to work at a hotel? And how do we really balance work-life balance? Because I think, uniquely, hotels are 24/7, 365-day operations. And so with the emerging trends around greater flexibility, and I think the reset that was put on from the pandemic, and I would argue even beforehand, around job flexibility and the rise of the gig economy, all of these considerations are things that are now impacting the labor market. So at Hilton, we're keen on embedding greater flexibility, choice, and control, bringing in the best talent. And I think even modernizing some of the roles and assignments within our hotels to make them more appealing to different generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, just I think all of the above, we are impacted, especially in hospitality with COVID. And first and foremost, when the labor market started to open back up, it was all about how to keep employees safe, how to understand audits, how to contact trace, how to protect the staff. And then as demand and occupancy started to increase again, you were having to bring back a bunch of people that maybe already left the industry. You're trying to attract new people. And so then it became this dynamic of, okay, now we have new people in the industry. How do you train them? How do you train them up on hospitality in an industry where there was maybe a deep cultural root and understanding with these new workers? So then it was all about how to keep these new entrants into hospitality happy. How do you train them? How do you make things very easy for them? How do you engage in ways that maybe, as JD was saying, how would they were used to in other industries, and offering that flexibility? And sometimes when the challenge of hospitality is offering flexibility in new ways, because you don't always maybe have that work from home option. So
Right.
How do you bring flexibility in new and creative ways to a traditional, you got to commute into work environment?
JD and Catherine, just stepping back from those comments a little bit, what is the state of the labor shortage that we've been hearing so much about? What trajectory do you see? How does March 2023 compare to how you would feel in March 2022?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly a top priority. I think if we ask our owners and our franchisees, what is one of the major issues for them, I think the labor shortage is still top of mind. I would say it's definitely gotten better than where it was 7 to 8 months ago. But I do think, it's added continual pressure for us to continue to evolve and think about the ways that we work. I love what Catherine had mentioned there, right? There's a sentiment around, frontline team members and service workers that has always been, hey, their job is executed when they're on site. And so much around the conversation has been about hybrid work, remote work. And that is sometimes just not as easily seen for frontline team members. And so really a lot of the conversation for us has been about how do you can embed that level of flexibility. Hotels are unique, as I said, 24/7, 365. There are necessities for work that needs to happen, when a customer is here, when a customer is present. But there's also work that we can change when it gets done in a hotel to provide that flexibility, to provide that hybrid nature. If you think about reservations as a department, 10, 15 years ago, reservation departments were always on property. That's centralized right now. We have team members in our HRCC that are working, at home, taking reservations and things like that. And so I think the pandemic has certainly elevated and fast-tracked our ability to think about the roles and responsibilities we have in hotels and how they can look a little bit different than they have in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. We keep trying to take that simplified approach. And, even something as basic, if you can imagine, before the pandemic, schedules were posted on a piece of paper in the break room. People had to come in to see when they worked and jot it down and go home. So it's as easy as a scheduling system that can be shared remotely, where staff can even swap shifts and build that flexibility in remotely. So some of those steps that might sound basic, are really big to the industry, and to be able to offer more flexibility, where we can.
What about with certain types of workers? So it sounds like reservations. That's an area where you might be able to have hybrid work, right? But there are other jobs, especially those where we've experienced a lot of labor shortages, say housekeeping. Some of the most severe labor shortages are in housekeeping or in the back of the house, where we can't create hybrid work. what types of innovations are we seeing there? I think some of it might be flexibility, like you're both talking about, but are there other innovations here that you're coming up with to deal with some of the labor shortages? And what role is technology playing with that, if any?
Great question. Absolutely. You know, Opti as an operations and housekeeping solution. You know, on one hand, you are trying to manage the labor. But sometimes you're also trying to manage the processes and work with what you have, right? And again, coming out of the new processes and the pandemic, you know, do you do stay over cleans every day? Can you flex that because you're short staffed? Can you flex that because of the guests you have? So how can that technology also work with you to make business process shifts with the people that you have, turn down services, customer requests for when they get housekeeping, and then you can manage the labor. So there's a lot of changes within the housekeeping softwares, and you know, coming out of the pandemic or right in the pandemic, you know, we were changing our software like crazy. It's no longer the rinse and repeat. You get your room cleaned every day, and so how can you use those processes just as normal business operation, but also to try to combat what people are seeing within the labor market as well to manage that.
Yeah, and I would add to Catherine's comment, I think for us, a lot of it really is the personalization and the customization of the customer experience, right? How can we know what Tash wants, what Catherine wants ahead of time so that we can proactively plan and task manage to those expectations? And we really want to create a personalized experience. There are customers that want daily housekeeping. There are customers that don't want housekeeping. Us being able to understand those preferences and technology is really helping. I think about our messaging system and even the preferences that our customers put within our honors app, where they list if they want to be on a high floor, if they want certain pillow types and things like that. You know, the more information we can gather ahead of the arrival of the customer, the more we can infuse that into the actions that our team members take in delivering that service and experience. So technology is playing a big part of that in making sure that it's seamless, that it's fast, and that the preferences are known, and about the accuracy of that information. So when a customer requests an amenity item or a hair dryer or whatever they may be, additional towels, how does that information flow down to a team member in order to have actionable insights for them to deliver that experience for the team for our customers? I think messaging is another big area that has seen some modernization. I think, you know, how many times do we text message versus phone call, or send an email versus a fax for that matter? You know, customers are interacting with us in the same way. And so where things used to be sort of voice communication, they're a text message, they may be an emoticon, they may be a request, right? So we're using a lot of technology to enable team members across the property, even internally, to message amongst themselves, but be able to directly interact with the customers through those channels and through, you know, the preferred channel of the customer. I think, you know, you had mentioned something else within housekeeping, and I think, you know, it is an area that I think, you know, there are a lot of discussions about robotics and automation and robotic vacuums, and I think a lot of this technology is helpful for team members, right, in simplifying their tasks and modernizing some of those assignments. But I do think that housekeeping in particular is one of the biggest areas in our hotels from a staffing perspective. I think if you look at the contribution that those team members make in terms of the guest experience and the amount of time they take in preparing a room, that experience is important. And I think that it's unlikely that it can be replaced by robotics and automation. I think it can be supplemented and modernized. But the call out I'd make around all of the technology is that hospitality is a business of people serving people. And I think that is first and foremost, when we look at technology, how do we make sure that it supports that perspective rather than replace it?
Actually, you make a good point there, Judy. It's interesting. I think before the pandemic, maybe housekeeping was though a large department, a large part of the P&L, maybe sometimes forgotten, or you just didn't maybe measure their guest impact in the same way. And then we were thrown into COVID, where cleanliness, safety was absolutely front and center. And I think that has really shifted the conversation and the dynamic of not just the processes, but the impact that the team has, and how you can keep them happy, how you can keep them supported, because it does have direct guest impacts. Not always a department that is interacting on an hourly or daily level with that guest, but it's driving such a large part of the guest experience. And so I think that's now been thrown front and center, where it wasn't part of the conversation 2-3 years ago.
Absolutely.
So on this subject, Brenda Cunningham, one of our webinar participants, has asked if there are any plans to incorporate automation or AI affecting or predicting any kind of like workforce demand or levels. And I know, Vince, you've worked in some of this regarding scheduling as one of the applications where you're seeing some advancement. And I'd love to hear anybody else talk about insights with regard to the automation process and moving, to that kind of, moving work to transactionally managed by, something other than a human being.
I'll start out by mentioning an observation as an operations academia. I think we completely miss frontline service work as a domain to bring analytics to. I think there's a big room, a lot of opportunity for growth. In recent years, I've worked on a hotel housekeeping scheduling problem, and that's just a new model for our field. So I'm curious, JD and Catherine, whether you see a lot of room for growth of analytics, predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, AI, to support decisions. There's a lot of value that's come from technology and digitization, but is there room to grow on the analytics curve for the hospitality industry?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can look at the news and not hear ChatGPT or this whole conversation around AI and how it's morphed everything from academia to medicine and healthcare. I think there's certainly a future there. I think we've incorporated AI from a training perspective in our ability to use virtual reality and helping team members, understand what their duties are, how to personalize service, how the sequence of steps and things like that. And I think it's a really interesting way for us to think about how we've morphed training across some of our hotels. I mean, chatbots and all of that stuff, going back to the messaging side, I think that there's certainly an ability for that to offload some work that would traditionally have been done by an individual. But I think it's really about how this kind of technology can provide the insights necessary back to the personalization. So, when Vince comes to a hotel, how is there information that's flowing direct to a guest service agent that says his last visit at the hotel was this, or he had a problem and we resolved it in this facet, or his preferences around a room are this. Again, that AI can help fuel the information and the personalization for us to create a differentiated experience. On the data side, go ahead.
No, let me jump in for a second. Sorry, JD. Fascinating. A couple of things, and this is coming from Ryan McCarthy, and it was something I was thinking about earlier as well. You've got now more discrete information that you're now able to extract about the operational environment. Is that changing then things like your standards? So, for example, you mentioned stayovers and this opt-in requirement right now. Is that now a permanent kind of shift that you're now seeing based on this customization effort that's informing your brand standards as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're looking at the data to inform some of those decisions, right? Like, I'll give you another example around arrival and check-in times, right? Understanding when our customers are checking in and when they're checking out allows us to more effectively plan labor at the front desk to make sure that, customers are not queuing up. To have a team member staff for 8 hours at the front desk when we have a big push of arrivals from 3 to 6 o'clock, using those analytics are helping us better position team members across the hotel to make sure that they're present, to reduce queue length, to increase service. On the housekeeping side, absolutely. I mean, you know, we're constantly evaluating what the standard should be for housekeeping and using these insights, as I mentioned, right? I think what's universal is that there's not a one size fits all. I think even before the pandemic, when a lot of the brands were doing daily housekeeping service, you had customers that had that D&D, that privacy. You know, I myself right now, I'm in a room in one of our hotels and I have the privacy sign on because I'm on a webinar, right? So I probably won't have housekeeping service today. That may be a little bit different when I travel for leisure or on my next trip. And so understanding this and being able to collect the data and understand the preferences is fueling how we staff our hotels and the services and how everything gets deployed, certainly.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tosh, I wonder if you maybe talk a little bit about the image that the industry is enjoying. And again, we're talking about some changes to the nature of work to a large extent. We know that the nature of work in the industry has not, enjoyed a very favorable view for a lot of, reasons that we can all identify. What are you looking at in terms of, the nature of work and whether we have still bad jobs or if there's innovation happening here that will allow us to maybe, sell and advertise, the industry in maybe a different light?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we've always sort of been an industry where there is a perception that these are not great jobs, right? Generally speaking, they've been lower paid jobs. They're difficult jobs to work in, physically demanding jobs with high levels of emotional labor. We don't have the same levels of remote work that other industries have. And I think post-COVID, coming out of the pandemic, we saw that these were factors that came into play when workers were thinking about where they wanted to work. We saw hospitality workers that had been in the industry for years leaving the industry to go to other industries that they felt were better climates, right? Or that had a perception of better jobs. I think we've seen a lot of change. And I think JD and Catherine can probably speak a little bit more to this. We've seen innovation, we've seen compensation go up. But I think there's still work to be done in terms of changing the perception of what it means to work in hospitality. And I know, Catherine, earlier you mentioned that now we're bringing in a lot of folks to the industry that have never worked in hospitality. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about, well, what are we doing to teach them about hospitality, right? What's important, not just to get them in the door, and so that we have a workforce, but what are we doing to retain them over time? And I think there are some opportunities here with things like career growth and promotion opportunities. This is an industry where you can really have a career for life. You could start at the bottom and work your way all the way to the top. And so I'd love to hear from both of you in terms of some of the innovations you're seeing in terms of, how do we make these jobs better jobs and change the perception of what it's like to work in hospitality?
Right. Yeah. I think your point about, not bad jobs, I think that they are not bad jobs. They're great jobs. And when you have this personal connection and personal interaction, that is where, when you look at technologies, how can the technologies help me eliminate or simplify kind of the rinse and repeat that gets maybe a bit monotonous, especially maybe people who are new to an industry and they step in and say, oh, this is really kind of same old every day. So how can you smarten up and remove that monotonous bit to allow people to have more quality time to be able to interact with the guests in better ways? I think that is one, major way. And then maybe just back to the AI point, because I think my internet connection was struggling just there on that AI. When we look at this from a software perspective, we are using AI to be able to influence not just the schedule, not just creating the 9 to 5 schedule, but smartening up the hours between 9 to 5. So in real time, we will understand that there's a family in a room versus a business traveler in a room. And so the expectation of cleaning a room is completely different when there's a family in there versus a lone business traveler. And so when the staff or the housekeeper sees that difference and realizes the technology is working with them because their expectation isn't exactly the same and rinse repeat, that we understand that staff member, and maybe they're newer and they need more time, versus less time on a different type of job, they feel that technology is enabling them to be successful rather than controlling and tracking. It's really working with them. And when they need information, they can access that. So that AI is always being leveraged to enable someone to be more successful and to help them be more successful, and just be that partner.
I think even if we look at the broader trends on labor, I mean, sourcing talent and these new emerging pools of talent, and I think gig workers are probably the most evident new market that we're sourcing from, right? And that's all embedded in this flexibility, right? Individuals that want to try different tasks, that want the flexibility to build a schedule around life and their needs, and companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash have really tapped into this and provided a different level of accessibility. It's slightly different within hotels because you can't just jump in your car and begin working. You have to come to site. But a lot of what we're focused in on is how do we become attractive to that workforce? And how can they see sort of these assignments? Because arguably one thing that exists with gig workers within hospitality, and particularly within our hotels, is a sense of community. And I think having friends at work and this longing and a community and a culture is something that we can provide that is different than when you're isolated in an Uber or in a Lyft or in a DoorDash by yourself. And I think that there's a group of individuals that's a really important part. And it's something we pride ourselves on at Hilton. And so how do we bring those individuals where flexibility is paramount? How do we provide them opportunities to partake in our culture, to partake in our community, to be contributors, but to work around their schedule rather than what has historically been an environment in which we said, tell us your availability. We will advance schedule you 2 weeks out in this, and you're scheduled for 40 hours. That market has shifted. And I think a lot of what Catherine and other software companies are doing is helping us map out those ebbs and flows, right? How do we look at labor planning, not in a traditional 8-hour shift, but it may be broken into 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. The sort of optimal mix of labor is going to be fundamentally different than what it was before, where we had full-time team members and we had part-time team members. And it's interesting because if you think conceptually, this has existed in our industry for a long time. If we think about banquet servers, banquet servers in many markets are shared across multiple hotels. They may work at one brand and another brand, right? They have the ability to pick up breakfast shifts, lunch shifts, dinner shifts. There's a great amount of autonomy and control that has always existed within that department. I think the onus is on us in saying, okay, well, that's worked really well. There's a group of workers that have enjoyed that luxury. How do we take that model and apply it to the different departments? How do we apply it to housekeeping? How do we apply it to front desk? How do we apply it to other components of food and beverage? And basically replicate what has worked really well and we have a proven use case for in order to attract different workers and provide that greater flexibility.
It sounds like you're also pushing the boundaries about what, typical work looks like. I think we've been subject to, narrowly defining roles, but in addition to the flexibility about when and where, it's also what you're asking people to potentially do as well. And I'm assuming you can use some of these analytics you're referring to as a means to redesign work and maybe change the boundaries of which we expect people to be able to support the service needs of our properties and hospitality, settings. So is that something you guys are looking at as well as, looking at the tasks that people are performing as well as the hours in which they perform them?
Absolutely. I think it was said a little bit earlier, right? There's an onus on us to modernize some of the assignments. I think, if you think about a room attendant position, that's gone really unchanged for a long time. There have been different models that say, how do we clean if you have a stayover specialist or if you have a checkout specialist, right? I think a lot of this repetition of tasks improves standards, taking from a lot of what healthcare and medicine has always done to improve quality control. But it's really morphed into understanding customer expectations. And I think one thing people long in hospitality is to build an experience, is to create a memory for a customer. That is our obligations, our desires. So as we look at the tasks, how do those happen differently now? And how do we infuse some of that analytics and data. Back to the example, right? If we know that Bruce prefers foam pillows to feather pillows, how do we bring that information so that room attendant can create that experience and make sure that when you arrive in your room, it's to your comfort and to your liking. And then just in terms of some of the other modernizations, I think technology in terms of connected rooms and what we're seeing in terms of the innovations in lighting and being able to walk into your room and have the drapes open and have your Spotify playing and have the temperature set to your preference, right? Those are all tasks that have historically been prepared by an individual that technology is helping. So how do we then, transform the sequence of service that a room attendant takes to incorporate those preferences into how they're deploying the service?
Yeah. And that is, as a software company, leveraging AI, that is exactly what we're doing. Understanding the tasks, but using AI to be able to be much smarter in the workflows, to learn, and ultimately then to drive guest satisfaction impact that we can measure, and also employee impact, so that they are happy, that they are trained, and then ultimately they stay longer.
So this will maybe push the conversation a little bit more broadly as well. And there's a couple questions I'll share from some of the participants in our webinar today. Emmett McKieran, I hope I'm saying that correctly, asks, in light of the reality that many hospitality jobs pay less than the comparable options, and some of the things that we're also seeing with regard to some, the changes that were noted previously, what are some of the tools and techniques that hospitality companies can use to retain and grow talent? And thoughts on, for example, elevating or leveraging the hotel or company culture, or soft benefits, or other things that maybe are not as salient in the minds of job seekers, but could in fact be a very nice lever for them to, be a little bit more enthusiastic about opportunities in our industry.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it goes back to what I mentioned early on, right? In terms of how do you replicate the experience that we have as a consumer and make sure that is an employee-employer relationship, and I'll drive home this idea of everything being on demand. And so one thing that we rolled out at Hilton about a year and a half ago was a same-day pay program and earned wage access, right? A lot of our properties had biweekly pay periods, and we heard from our team members, right, a greater desire for their pay to be received at different intervals, right? And so we looked at the ability to potentially move it to weekly, but if we moved it to weekly, that didn't meet the requirements of somebody who might want it daily, and were we alienating people who liked it every 2 weeks, right? And so I think same day pay was a big change really in our industry, and sort of modernizing the payroll processes that had, not been changed for years. And that was a desire to replicate the experiences that people had with Venmo and with instant payments, and with a lot of the different ways that they were able to access their finances as consumers. That had a monumental impact for us from a retention perspective. And that's, hones in on this idea of flexibility. Flexibility is something different for everybody. It's the flexibility of where you work, of when you work. It may be the flexibility of when you get paid. And so I really challenge a lot of our owners and our operators, and internally, we think about this all the time. Is like, where can we embed that in the team member experience across all sorts of different channels? The other thing I'll call out really is the importance of mental wellness and care for all, and how do we provide resourcing for team members that give them accessibility to these resources, and provide them the support that's necessary in order for them to be their best self. Because we succeed as an organization when our team members come and can be focused, can be their true authentic self when they come to work. And so how do we supplement and provide them with those networks in order to if it's childcare resources, if it's caring for the elderly, particularly as we have a bit of an aging workforce, right? The connection points for those types of things. How do they care for themselves? So mental wellness has been a top priority for us, and I think something that has finally been a little bit more destigmatized, but really needs to be front and center, I think, of any organization.
That goes back to what you were talking about earlier regarding connection points and the ways in which you can facilitate those. And I'm assuming that links in directly with your priority on mental health and well-being as a way in which your employees and team members know the resources that are available to them and what they can do to leverage those to meet their individual needs. Let's talk a little bit more about that customization of the employee experience. And for example, when you look at diversity as an issue, for example, and you've tried to cater to a lot of different types of needs or values or perspectives, what are you doing to really create, for example, an environment where individuals do feel like this is a good gig and they do feel included, they've got a voice, and that they have an ability to really have control over their employment situation?
Yeah, I think it comes down to different channels in which we can get feedback from our team members, right? So we have surveys in which we get that feedback, but in a number of our hotels recently, we've pulled together mobile technologies that allow our team members to communicate in different fashions, to communicate internally with one another, to direct message one another, to be able to share and celebrate, reward, and recognize each other through mobile channels that I think have morphed a lot of the ways we celebrated those things before. Posters and property events. A lot of that stuff has to move digitally. Because that's the way that our team members are experiencing things, right? Everybody's on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, on all of these types of channels. And so creating a digital frontline team member experience in the same fashion has been really, really impactful for us. And then, not to harp back on the flexibility component, but I think that is a big driver in our ability to bring in diverse talent into the organization, right? We have an ability to bring in students who might not have traditionally looked at our employment because they can't give up an 8-hour shift when they're working in between classes or managing a workload, right? For them, what's important is a 4 or 5, 6-hour shift, which is why they may have looked at some of the gig endeavors. And then similarly, Encore retirees and people that have left the workforce but want some level of flexibility in between their retirement to pick up a different level of work, but work really to their hours. And I think that's an attractive workforce for us for a multitude of different reasons, because they've been in there from a training and development perspective. They have a lot of those types of skills. And I think we can offset, their needs for flexibility with a great set of benefits for them to be able to travel, but to work on their requirements. So I think tapping into these, I won't say emerging, but these different talent pools that historically have not been a major draw for us is a way in which, we're meeting our diversity and inclusion objectives.
Nice.
Yeah. I think maybe just one small example, because yes, all these different pools are coming in and maybe not familiar with hospitality. And so how can you embrace them? How can you help them? How can you train them and bring them into the culture as quickly as possible? But another real basic challenge that we have seen, and we've seen that here in the US, we see that a lot over in Europe, is just even the diversity on the language front. When you are managing housekeeping departments and back of house operations, there can be a dozen languages spoken. And so how does your software in real time translate conversations for them? And so we've gone to great lengths to ensure that we do inline and real-time translations, that if a team leader is communicating something in Spanish, that everyone is receiving that language in their language settings, whether that be English or Portuguese or whatever, that all of those communications are also happening in real time. So again, it's giving that sense of community and ensuring that everyone has a voice and can make that voice and then be completely understood on the end. So that's just one small example, but we've seen that have really huge impacts on employee satisfaction and continue to roll that out.
There's a question. We'll backtrack just slightly. Marshall Burke asks smartly, what is being done now to attract new individuals to our industry? And the observation about no longer seeing any much in terms of innovation with regard to the advertisements. And I had my students in class, in fact, go to a couple of job boards, and they were a little lukewarm about what they saw, and some of it is a function of just the functionality, but it also has to do with what employers are actually promoting. So what are you seeing out there that makes, employers stand out and be able to tap into some of these additional, maybe turn the people back who weren't, who left the industry and weren't very happy with what happened, get those folks who wouldn't, were going to be a little more resistant to coming back to give us a second chance?
I think one of the biggest things really is evolving the recruiting strategies. I think there are many cases in which the ways in which we bring talent in is cumbersome, right? Load your resume here, select your things, provide us your work experience, right? Those things are not what individuals are looking for, right? Everything is on demand. They're able to text really quickly and get all the information that they need on their fingertips, right? We've got to replicate that process, I think, in the recruiting side in order to bring a differentiated candidate back in the doors, really to make it as simple as it is, right? So, things like text messaging recruiting, a lot of this AI technology is coming in here, right? Being able to schedule a candidate and say, hey, come in 3 days right now, in 3 days, we'll be able to interview you in person. I mean, they found a job within 20 hours from that initial conversation. So we've got to, I think, modernize a lot of that approach to recruiting. I think the other thing that we've really have to focus on is the experience, right? And what it means to work in hospitality and to provide an experience and make a memory. I think a lot of things, and the call out I think is super accurate. When we look across the landscape of job postings and things like that, it's really unclear around what a job in hospitality actually is, right? It's somebody lifting a sheet and throwing it up. It's a server with a tray by the pool, right? There are, and Tash mentioned this earlier on, there are very, very few professions, I think, where you can start at the very bottom and grow your career. I think, my great example is our CEO, Chris, started as a engineer intern, right? And as the CEO of our organization. And if I look at our senior leadership group at Hilton, it is very much that. And our general managers, started as line level team members and have grown to general managers because we support their growth. We need to tell that story more effectively, and we need to tell that story through channels that individuals are looking at. So, TikTok, Instagram, a lot of this type of stuff. Remind folks around what it is to be at a hotel. I'm at our property in Arizona, and I don't think that there's a better place to walk out and you see the mountains, you see these beautiful pools, the same thing in beach resorts or in urban destinations. I mean, there really are few locales and spaces in which it's just an invigorating environment to work in. So telling that story and amplifying it, I think is really important.
Yeah, I can only second that. I think to build on that, the more we can engage and tell that story up front, and especially when you're attracting people new to the industry, there's going to be less maybe misalignment of expectations after they get in the door. Because I think some people are coming expecting maybe one thing and being surprised at what the day in the life sort of looks like. So the more we can get them excited, the more we can engage with them before, I think also just really helps align expectations once they're there on site.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think part of the challenge, again, going back to something you said earlier, Catherine, about bringing new people in the door that have never worked in hospitality is the messaging, right? It's communicating to them, but communicating before they walk in that door about what the job's actually going to look like, giving them a realistic job preview so that we don't have those quick quits, right? Those individuals who walk in the door and are quitting within 30, 60, 90 days of employment. And so sort of going back to something JD said earlier about recruiting, I think that's really important, right? It's important to be able to get the workforce, but I think it's also really important to keep them. And so that's where we really need to focus, I think, on the retention and the growth opportunities, telling the stories, but also creating the stories, right? Showing them that there are opportunities for growth and that they can see their colleague being promoted to positions, and that there is really a space for them to grow and have a lifelong career.
I think one of the other call outs I'll make, for operators really is just a reminder, I think, through the last few years, right, as many hotels had to get shuttered and cost control became, paramount importance really as we go back, just reinvigorating the spaces for our team members and employees, right? The back of house spaces, if it's dimly lit, if it's leaking, if the paint is peeling on the wall, right? Team members want to come and have an environment in which they can thrive, in which they can feel good about. And we've been in situations where you sit in those types of spaces and it's not a comforting experience, right? And it's always sort of it is a low cost, high impact opportunity that I think sometimes goes surpassed because we always look sort of at the front facing customer focused positions, but the back of house, the cleanliness of the back of house, the prevalence of food options and healthy food options, of beverage stations and things like that, that is low cost, high impact that can reduce a lot of turnover that people are excited about. Across many of our hotels, we offer 1 or 2 hot meals for our team members, and it's monumental when you ask folks, hey, what's your favorite benefit here? And they're like, oh, I get to have lunch here. And even in the pandemic, when we had to shutter down some of those facilities for the security and things like that, and we're providing other options, either gift cards for groceries or alternatives for them to get meals, one thing we heard loud and clear from a team member is like, okay, this is great, but now I have to go to the grocery store. Now I'm required to cook. That's time away from my family. So don't underestimate the impact of being able to come and have a hot meal, to be able to sit down, to socialize with your colleagues. I think that's probably one of the biggest areas that is helping us from a retention perspective.
It's great to hear that positive example for retention. What are some other things that you think the industry should focus on in upcoming years as stressors that might drive turnover? Operational things like schedule volatility, or maybe something about training. What comes to mind as a good high priority emphasis for the hospitality industry in the future for retention?
I think that going back on something that we said earlier about really recognizing and rewarding a job well done. Many times on some of these roles in hospitality, things are happening behind the scenes and not necessarily in full view of a manager, a supervisor, someone else there on site. And so the better we can do about measuring the job well done and tracking that and rewarding that so that people feel that visibility and that they're receiving that visibility, I think also really helps on the retention side. It's not out of sight, out of mind. It's out of sight. How can we help? And to make sure that is recognized.
Do you see any cross-border kinds of considerations when you're looking at some of the topics we've covered today? So take the recruitment, for example. Are you seeing a variation, JD, in Hilton's strategy when you're looking at regional variation in terms of labor market needs? So, for example, when you might have an influx of individuals who are escaping, a war situation, or who coming from a very impoverished setting, and being able to, take advantage of those types of situations from an employment standpoint, does that mean you've got a very fluid types of staffing approach, or how does that work for you all?
I mean, for us, we have to source from every market. I think it's our obligation, particularly as those folks come into different countries, the impact of what's happening in Ukraine as an example, and some of the things we've seen. I mean, there's certainly a marketplace that we want to tap into, and I think a great opportunity for us to create rewarding careers for folks that are in those situations. But I think, our talent strategy is diverse. It's looking at every single group, as I mentioned. It's looking at refugees. It's looking at encore careers. It's looking at youth. It's looking at, capturing folks from other service industries and bringing them into hospitality.
Well, but this, where I want to go with this, does this then extend then, sort of the HR consideration here in terms of, having to be a political, lobbyist in some cases to make sure that you're aligned appropriately with the interests that will allow you to take advantage of labor that may be opportunistically, available to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So those are some of the things that I think, questions coming from some of the participants about how broadly do I need to be aligned, not just within my own organization, but to your point, JD, broadly within a variety of different local and community-based organizations that, are going to be important to make sure you've got your fingers on the pulse in appropriate ways that will allow you to leverage the types of opportunities that do come your way.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Great. We have a couple more minutes remaining here, and I think there's a couple of things that I would like to maybe consider here on the retention side. We have obviously talked a bit about, being a more attractive employer to those who, may not know us very well, but for those who do and have been looking under the hood for quite some time and know the good, the bad, and the not so great. What are some of the things that we're doing from a retention side, from a culture building standpoint, to try to make, continue to keep the narrative positive and demonstrate that, you are in a caretaking business and really trying to nurture the lives of the employees that are in your employ?
I think a twofold. Again, the flexibility component, I think it's top of mind for everybody, right? And the challenges that folks are facing in terms of childcare coverage and caring for elderly and things like that, making sure that we're transparent around the fact that we are a flexible industry, right?
But
and
it's focused on family. Is that where you're going here? So because I think the idea that work is not necessarily in the center point of everybody's thinking or perspective these days. It's moved to the side. And is that what you're talking about here, is recognizing the center point that personal life has in most people's decision making?
Fully. Yep. Exactly it. I think the greater desire is for us to continue to emphasize that, life doesn't have to fit into work, that work should fit into your life. And so enabling that functionality, enabling that choice and control for our team members across all of our hotels. And I think it's also the flexibility of allowing that choice and control for the team member to make. And for them to inform us about what works for them. Maybe their schedule for 1 month can be this, and for another month it can be this. It's about creating further opportunities for mobility, for hybrid work. I think the narrative has to be that we are flexible and we can enable a lot of these types of things. And it's a mindset shift for, I think, a lot of on-property leaders to think about this type of stuff, right? We've already had the discussion, and I think I've even fallen victim of saying, hey, frontline team members have to physically be present in order to execute some of their roles. We're really starting to challenge some of those norms and understand, hey, housekeeping as an example has traditionally been an 8 to 3 or 8 to 4 shift. Realistically, is that the necessity, right? A customer checks out at 11 o'clock, they check back in to 3 o'clock. And I know Vince has done a lot of work examining some of these types of things, but could we even change the shift parameters of what housekeeping looks like? The same thing from a banquets perspective, right? A lot of sort of static shifts that we had an AM, a PM, and a mid shift structure in a hotel can fundamentally be challenged using a lot of the data and analytics. And I think we've got to continue to amplify that. That's what we're examining, and that's how we're morphing and modernizing some of the roles and responsibilities.
Yeah. And with, as a software solution, I think with that flexibility does come complexity. And so what we don't want to do is create a highly flexible environment that shifts the hugely complex the process of trying to figure out all these preferences and changes and everything else. So this is where the technology angle really comes in to be able to enable all that flexibility on the back end and take that complexity and make it immensely simple from a management perspective, from a planning perspective, from a scheduling perspective. So with all those flexibility rules, you should still be able to break out the house, at the touch of the button in 5 minutes, because it takes all that into consideration. It allows people to swap. It understands, all the late checkouts, want to clean, do out rooms first and stay over rooms later. Again, just to bring simplicity where there's that flexibility, and that is actually creating system complexity. And that's really, where we're trying to ease all those pain points for the hotels. Because it is complex. The more change, the more options you give, the more complexity are the workflows and all the connection points behind the scenes.
I think this raises an interesting question about the role of leaders and what types of leaders and managers we need going in to the future, thinking about the next 100 days or 100 months or 100 years, right? What types of managers and leaders do we need to get us there? And I think, JD, you're already starting to talk, you talked a little bit about managers and some of the pushback you get with things like flexibility, but what are we really looking for, not just from our employees, but from our managers as well, to get us to where we need to be?
I think, for me, what's paramount is really leaders that look at the team members' interests at heart, right? And understand the nuances and understand that it's not a one size fits all, and that we need to be, we need to be flexible ourselves in terms of understanding those circumstances. I think it's really about culture. I think where we see the leaders succeed and have teams that are empowered, that are empathetic, that are delivering on experiences, are those leaders that exemplify those qualities themselves, and that can build a culture more than anything else, even outside of the business metrics and KPIs and things like that, performance metrics that they have. I think the other thing really is looking at other industries and sort of the progress that's been made in terms of how they've really reevaluated things. And I think that there are a lot of different companies, in retail in particular, that have fundamentally thought about their business models a lot differently. I would say the hospitality industry has been a little slower than others in evolving some of those consumer behaviors, and how do we embed that? So I think it's not being insular in terms of what the industry has been, but how are the experiences that they feel as a consumer, how can we replicate some of those within their teams and in their properties?
Yeah. And I think from our perspective, we're seeing the roles change very much of those leaders. Back to the comment on rinse and repeat. So the team leads aren't just checking the tasks. The solutions should already enable that task checking, and then that's happening. And so the leaders can go and help, or go offer advice, or see that someone is running a bit behind because they're having some really complex tasks in front of them. So step in and deploy someone else to help in the situation. So it really just changes this qualitative, empathetic leader to, again, drive the guest experience, to help with happy staff and employees, rather than just checks and controls. It's a very different shift.
So we're looking at, in fact, some skill differences and skill needs that we need from our leadership teams that do reflect some of those operational changes that we're starting to see to, support the employees' efforts, and, increasing the efficiency that you all mentioned, as well as maintaining a high quality service environment as well for everybody involved. Fascinating. Love it. I really appreciate your insights. It's been wonderful. Is there anything that you would like to, I believe any of the panelists an opportunity to sort of look forward and a final comment or two on some of the most salient kinds of trends that we're seeing that are likely to be on our radar screen for some time? Catherine, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think just building on that point before, we are in the hospitality industry that is offering hospitality. That is that guest connection. And no matter how smart a technology is, when we're approaching this, this is really about the human interaction, and to be able to allow our software to just help that connection at the end of the day, and not be in this for software's sake, but really being a hospitality company that's working on a software and not really a software that's, geared toward the hospitality. So I think that historical and industry perspective, always coming at that from the new angles. And at the end of the day, we're in the people business. So.
I echo Catherine's sentiments as well. I think, we are definitely entering the golden age of travel. And I think that if we saw anything kind of coming out of the pandemic, I mean, being isolated is not what any of us desire. And the ability to explore and experience and to be connected to people will always forever be there. And so our role, as Catherine mentioned, is to make sure that team members in our hotels and across properties feel empowered in order to make those experiences. And that there's the technology to simplify a lot of the processes, not to replace, but to support a lot of their abilities.
Wonderful. I appreciate that as a really good note to conclude on. I do appreciate everybody's willingness to share your insights on some of the current state of affairs and some of our hopes for the future. Thanks to everybody for joining us today, and do feel free to reach out and follow up as you see fit. I wish everybody all the best, and I look forward to seeing you online again very soon. Take care.
Thank you.